So my name is Aneta Rostkowska, and I'm a director of Center for Contemporary Art Temporary Gallery in Cologne. We are a mid-scale art institution founded mostly by the city of Cologne. And this year we are starting a new endeavor dedicated to the topic of kinship. In this adventure, my main companion is Chris Dietel, curator from Rotterdam, who is also here with us and will moderate this meeting. Please check her website and the upcoming book that is also actually related to the topic of our gathering today, and there will be a book launch in Cologne soon. Just to say a few words about the project before we introduce Sophie Lewis. I think both of us were really interested in how we are forming different relations in contemporary times, how we are connecting with other people, and what kind of connections we form outside of this more traditional structure of a nuclear family, we thought it's a topic that is not only interesting for us professionally, but also, of course, privately, and we would love to dedicate more time to it. So we established a kind of a study group this year and planned an exhibition and hopefully a publication for next year. Concerning some different aspects of this project, I guess the project is quite broad, and I think it entails different levels of radicality. I think today maybe we will go in the more radical direction. We'll see. But we in this kind of a more radical critique of a nuclear family, but we are also interested in other levels of radicality, maybe extensions of nuclear families or different families coming together. We are trying to kind of create a more broad constellation of sub-themes so that a lot of potential participants can feel included with their questions and concerns. We already had some events dedicated to this project. The last one happened in Kassel in collaboration with Documenta Institute, where together with Miyu and Aiwen Yin, we talked about different forms of relations we undertake in lives and how different types of games and apps can support them. And in fact, together with the students of Miyu, we were playing a very interesting role-playing game developed by Yin Aiwen that ultimately should lead to an app and a collaboration with a selected municipality. And it's a very advanced and very, very progressive and politically, I would say, conscious project that really encourages you to think deeply and more profoundly about the relations you form in your life and how you basically construct your life through different types of relations, especially care relations. So I will post the link to the website of Aiwen Yin if you are interested in that. It's a truly impressive project that she started, and I hope maybe we can organize some iterations of this game in Cologne next year. So we will be for sure interested in working with artists and theorists that not only talk about different forms of kinship, but also kind of actively contribute to forming kinship, non-standard kinship relations. Or about the language, I hope we talk later. Definitely there is a problem with language here, and we need some new constellation of concepts and names. Quite important aspect of this project is also related to the development of technology, especially different types of reproduction technologies, how they on one side can make the quest for biological reproduction even stronger, or on the other side can make can allow us to construct the biological kinship in a more conscious way and kind of control it better than in the past. So we hope that we will also have a discussion dedicated to that. In general, if you are interested in how this project evolves and you would like to participate in the, other gatherings of this study group, you can order a newsletter of Temporary Gallery. I will also provide a link in the chat window, and we hope that you stay with us and we collectively maybe envision some interesting future beyond and parallel to the nuclear family that either replaces it or coexists with it in a meaningful way. We'll see. Yeah, now I want to ask my colleague Chris Dittal to continue and tell you a little bit more about the project and introduce our guest.
Thank you, Aneta.
Please,
Thank you. Just to add to what you said already, I work as an independent curator and editor, and I represent the more radical wing in our research project. And I think with this study group, we also wanted to open up our research and to kind of collectively speculate about the possibilities of kinship. And we wanted to think about how to form relations outside of the nuclear family structure, meaning a structure that beyond the boundary of property relations and the social reproduction of norms. And with this project, we're interested in the critique of the nuclear family, but we also hope to take this critical spirit and into the practices of sharing and learning from each other, and most importantly, thinking about other ways of organizing life and social relations. So as Aneta mentioned, we already have had a few sessions or meetings where we discussed, for instance, the social and economic history of the family. We talked about how, say, policies of mercantilism, and we talked about the family as a form of primitive accumulation for the production of the workforce. We also discussed how we are oriented towards certain social structures more than others. In the future, we also hope to think about the perspective of children, how to see children as people with agency, and how on one hand, oftentimes they are seen as a projection to the future, but also as a strange kind of responsible for the future. And then we are also, one of my favorite topics is to talk about love in relation to family, or what other forms of love there can be than the possessive, so-called possessive love, which is maybe most prominent in family structures. And also to think about, that there is other ways, and to think about the fantasy of the unconditional love, perhaps. But today we will talk about the maybe contested or heavy notion of family abolition. And I think in her talk, Sophie Lewis will further illuminate what is meant by this term, and what are its politics, and perhaps its kind of utopian vision, as a way to think about the future of care and collective practice. And we are also very curious to hear how we can think about family abolition in political context, where the Indigenous, the minoritarian, the racialized family is already abolished or pre-abolished, in Sophie's words. I will read out Sophie's bio briefly. Sophie Lewis' first book was Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against the Family, published by Verso in 2019, which was also very influential for our thinking and discussions around this project. So we are really grateful for Sophie for sharing an excerpt from her forthcoming book for this session, titled Abolish the Family, a Manifesto for Care and Liberation, to be published by Verso Books and Salvage editions in October this year. Sophie studied English and environment at Oxford, politics at the New School and geography at Manchester. Her theorizing and cultural criticism appears in venues ranging from N+1 and the LRB to feminist theory. A teaching faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania's Center for Research on Feminist, Queer and Transgender Studies. Sophie is nevertheless a freelance writer dependent on public speaking and Patreon. So you can find her as Repro Utopia on Patreon. So before I give the floor to Sophie, I would like to repeat some of the way to organize this meeting. So please feel free to use the chat window and pose your questions and commentary there. And after Sophie's talk, we will have plenty of time for a Q&A. And I would like to ask you to raise hand if you would like to speak, and then we can unmute you in the chat window instead of using the raise hand function, which I might not be able to monitor properly. And or write your questions in the chat. That's also really fine. And I would like to give the floor to Sophie, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Hello from Lenny Lenape territory. It's 2 p.m. in Philadelphia. I'm overwhelmed with the enthusiasm for this event, and a little sheepish because I didn't really check this with my publishers, whether it was okay to give you half of a manuscript in production to read 6 months before it officially comes out. So please don't tell anyone. Thank you, Aneta and Chris, for this wonderful invitation and this opportunity to share with you my thoughts. So I'll get started. You received a draft of chapters 1 and 2 of this new project, and today I'll basically be mashing up and presenting some of what you will have already received, and I'll skip to the final argument, which talks a little bit about how kinship and radical kinship is not necessarily the only framework we might adopt as family abolitionists, which is in fact a bit of a departure from things I was saying in Full Surrogacy Now. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. What is the family? So deep runs the idea of the family, and the idea that the family is the exclusive place where people are safe, where people come from, where people are made, and thus where people belong, that it doesn't even really feel like an idea anymore. So let us unpack it and unpick it then. The family is the reason we are supposed to want to go to work. It's the reason we have to go to work and the reason we can go to work. As every civic-minded individual's raison d'être par excellence, family is an ostensibly non-individualist creed, an unselfish principle one voluntarily signs up to without thinking about it. What alternative could there be? The economic assumption that behind every breadwinner, there is a private someone or someone's worth being exploited for, notably some kind of wife, i.e. a person who is likely a breadwinner too, possibly even the same person. These things don't map neatly onto bounded bodies, but often sort of overlap. And that person, that someone or someone's, is sort of freely making sandwiches with the hard-won bread, or hiring someone else to do so, vacuuming up the crumbs and refrigerating leftovers such that more bread can be won tomorrow. This feels to many of us like a description of human nature. Without the family, who or what would take responsibility for the lives of non-workers, including the ill, the young, and the elderly? But this question is a bad one. We don't hesitate to say that animals might be better off outside of zoos, even if they have become used to the abuse of zoos, and even if there aren't that many other places for animals to live in a world that has built zoos. Similarly, transition out of the family would obviously be tricky, yes, but the family is doing a bad job at care, and we all deserve better. The family is getting in the way of alternatives. But in part, the vertiginous question, what's the alternative, arises because it's not just the worker and her work that the family gives birth to every day. The family is also the legal assertion that a baby, a neonatal human, is the creation of the familial romantic dyad, and that this act of authorship in turn generates for the authors property rights in their progeny, parenthood basically. But also, as well as those rights, quasi-exclusive accountability for the child's life. The near total dependence of the young person on these guardians is portrayed not as the harsh lottery that it patently is, but rather as natural, not in need of social mitigation, and furthermore, as beautiful for all concerned. Children, it is proposed, benefit from having only one or two parents and extremely few other caregivers. Parents, it is supposed, derive nothing so much as joy from the romance of this isolated intensity. Constant allusions to the hell world of sheer exhaustion parents inhabit notwithstanding, all too seldom is parenthood identified as an absurdly unfair distribution of labor, a despotic distribution of responsibility for and power over young people, a distribution that could be changed. Like a microcosm of the nation's state, the family incubates chauvinism and competition. Like a factory with a billion branches, it manufactures individuals with a cultural, ethnic, and binary gender identity, a class, and a racial consciousness. Like an infinitely renewable energy source, it performs free labor for the market. Like an organic element of historical progress, writes Anne McClintock in Imperial Leather, it worked for imperialism as an image of hierarchy within unity that grew, quote, indispensable for legitimating exclusion and hierarchy, unquote. For all these reasons, the family functions as capitalism's base unit. In Mario Mieli's phrase, the cell of the social tissue. It may be easier to imagine the end of capitalism, as I've riffed elsewhere, than the end of the family. But as I emphasized a lot in Full Surrogacy Now, everyday utopian experiments do generate strands of an altogether different social tissue, microcultures which could be scaled up if the movement for a classless society took seriously the premise that households can be formed freely and run democratically, the principle that no one shall be deprived of food, shelter, or care because they don't work. Family values and politics with a capital P have long been synonyms. When Margaret Thatcher, the milk snatcher of the 80s, said that there is no such thing as society, there are individual men and women, and there are families, quote unquote, she was not so much, alas, winning an argument against anti-family foes on the left as triumphantly making a capitalist reality explicit. At the same time, the family as a lived experience is as much of a social fiction as the family qua mode of governance is economic fact. Relatively few human beings actually live in one, and this doesn't matter. While seeming chosen and optional, the family's hegemonic status consigns those outside its frame to social illegibility. Thus, all of us are seduced, or at least disciplined anyway. We cannot escape it, even when we individually reject it. And even when we reject it, we worry that its much vaunted disintegration presages something worse. Everybody loses. For all purposes except capital accumulation, the promise of family falls abjectly short of itself. Often it's nobody's fault per se, simply too much is being asked of too few. On the other hand, the family is where the vast majority of the rape happens on this earth, and the vast majority of the murder too. No one is more likely to rob, bully, blackmail, manipulate, or hit you, or inflict unwanted touch than family. Logically, announcing an intention to, quote unquote, treat you like family, as so many airlines, restaurants, banks, and retailers do, ought to register as a horrible threat. Instead, to be metaphorically family in someone's eyes makes believe that one has something quite unfamiliar, namely acceptance, solidarity, an open promise of help, welcome, and care. And of course, the administrative grid of the family does organize where certain forms of help are legally obligated to and do come from. But this has nothing to do with solidarity. The family, predicated on the privatization of that which should be common, and on proprietary concepts of couple, blood, and gene, is a state institution, not a popular organism. It's at once a normative aspiration and a last resort, a blackmail passing itself off as a fate, a shitty contract pretending to be biological necessity. How does the family still serve as the standard for all other relational possibilities? I don't really know, but perhaps it is because, to quote Richard Seymour, the family can be, though it is not necessarily, the heart of a heartless world. I suspect the religion of family revolves around this glowing hope that it will be. We are clasping at a chance of guaranteed belonging, trust, recognition, and fulfillment. After all, the family dream is a dream of a haven, which is the very opposite of hunger or straitjackets. Idiomatically, to say that someone is like family is meant to convey in the strongest possible terms, I claim you, I love you, I consider our fates bound up together. We have no stronger metaphor. But why use this metaphor? Okay. I'm shifting gears a little bit to tackle the question of which family we should abolish. Because at this juncture, it seems possible that you are thinking, how could one possibly talk about abolishing the family in, for example, a Palestinian organizing context in which the Indigenous family is always already pre-abolished by the genocidal occupying power? How can one say abolish the family to the detainees in refugee camps separated purposively from their kinfolk? fleeing El Salvador, Guatemala, Sudan, Colombia, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, or indeed Ukraine. In what sense would one expect LGBT people to sign up to an agenda that sounds like a demand to not have access to the same hospital kin visitation rights and procreative technologies straight people do? Perhaps it would be better to call for an expanded family or a reformed version of the family rather than an abolished one. It makes no sense to run the risk of appearing to compare the downsides of colonized people's kinship practices with the carceral state. Surely it is reckless to seek to defend a politics that might be construed as saying that families, the very thing that often works tirelessly to protect Black, migrant, and Indigenous youth from violence, hiding them from cops and freeing them from jails and so on, are equivalent somehow to their enemies, cops, courts, and jails. As you can see, I'm semi-fluent, almost impassioned when it comes to reeling out points against becoming a partisan of family abolition. They are compelling, these counter-arguments, including to me. Since publishing Full Surrogacy Now, they have given me pause and stretched my thinking and spawned too many discussions to count. Even now, I'm almost persuaded that saying abolish the family is too risky, too unstrategic, utopian in the wrong sense of the word utopian. I am almost persuaded, but not quite. I will now do my best to take you through the case for a critically utopianist position, assembling arguments from Hortense Spillers, Tiffany Letabo King, Jennifer Nash, Hazel Carby, Paul Gilroy, Kathy Weeks, Kay Lindsay, Lola Olufemi, and Annie Olaloku Teriba. As all these teachers of mine are well aware, there have been bad white versions of anti-family feminism in the past, and there remain bad white versions of queer and feminist family abolition discourse now. For example, some of it sort of came out of the woodwork under the initial lockdowns of the COVID era. I observed on social media a small number of privileged women and young queer people briefly appropriating the terminology of family abolition in order to rail against physical distancing and shelter-in-place directives, resenting being deprived of their domestic help and of queer sexual freedoms, respectively. From what I saw, however, these blips in question were rightly teased, chided, and refuted. For well over a century, as we will see, socialists, feminists, and revolutionaries in the US have argued over the best orientation to take towards forms of family that are not, or at least don't seem to be, bourgeois or white. The fight hit the mainstream when, in 1965, the US Labor Secretary officially diagnosed the female-led Negro family as a tangle of pathology, quote unquote, galvanizing an entire critical tradition back into action. Previously, in the 30s, Black sociologists like the socialist E. Franklin Frazier had set out to discover and appropriate for the purposes of a politics of Black respectability a true pastoral Black family within the archive of slavery. Naturally, the violently anti-Black Moynihan Report revived this tradition. This time around, though, a skeptical left feminist counter-tradition emerged as well, which peaked with the philosopher Hortense Spillers' epochal account of the production of Black unmotherhood in antebellum America, mama's baby, papa's maybe. Unimpressed with the reconciliatory misogyny embedded in pro-Black protestations like Frazier's that enslaved people had always aspired to the patriarchal family as best they could, with the implication that hence their descendants can and will uphold it. Spillers wants to take the violently produced kinlessness of Black people seriously enough to necessitate the crafting of a whole new kin equivalent way of being and relating. She writes, whether or not we decide that the support systems that African Americans derived under conditions of captivity should be called family or something else strikes me as supremely impertinent. She means impertinent as irrelevant. She has an incredibly queenly way of writing. The point for Spillers is that, quote, African peoples in the historic diaspora had nothing to prove, given that it is stunningly evident that they were capable of modes of care at least as complex as those of the nuclear family in the West, unquote. Rather than orienting towards the family as a measuring stick or an aspiration, Spillers focuses on the fact that Black women in the wake of slavery stand, quote, out of the traditional symbolics of female gender and what this means for political struggle. Namely, quote, it is our task to make a place for this different social subject, a place, in other words, that one might call a family or not. So whereas Frazier's good revisionist history, as Spillers calls it, of the Negro family is ironically quite close to Moynihan's, i.e. both agree that a matriarchat is something obscene. Spillers discards both options, proposing that the existing grammar of American life is unfit for purpose for Black women specifically. Quote, we are less interested in joining the ranks of gendered femaleness than gaining the insurgent ground as female social subject, unquote. Spiller's text can be read as family abolitionist, and Tiffany Latabo King does read it that way in a 2018 essay to great effect. But apart from Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, King notes, Black scholarly and feminist or womanist responses to the Moynihan report rarely go that far. Quote, rarely do they interrogate the viability of the notion of the family itself, unquote. Rather, in that tradition, arguments are typically made for expanded, extended, non-sanguinal, queer, diversified, and intergenerational alternatives to the family. For King, the problem with these modifications and revisions to the family is that they, quote, still retain attachment to the liberal humanistic concept of the filial, which means that they refer back to the human subject of liberalism who has not been ungendered via slavery, and so don't quite break free of the definition of kinship as property relation, that Spillers in the 80s exposed as elemental to white American culture, being its racial/gender grammar. The rubric of Black motherhood, for those of us who want to defend it against the necro-political forces that crush and denigrate it, inspires celebratory and even ecstatic queer utopian theorization. As a result, it has to be said, we don't always leave ourselves much room to challenge possible patriarchal and proprietary violences by mothers of any gender who might be located, within Black families. we don't always leave ourselves room to note the violence that the celebratory model potentially does to those mothers themselves. The 2016 anthology Revolutionary Mothering, co-edited by Gums, Martins, and Williams, seeks to queer the expanded Black kinship field associated with Carol Stack's touchstone ethnography, All Our Kin. It oscillates, I think, between revaluing devalued motherhoods in a language of queer euphoria and flirting with the idea that while mothering is revolutionary, motherhood is part of what has to go. Rereading the anthology recently with Tiffany Letabo King's perspectives in mind, I mused on how tenaciously the family as a naturalized form of human organization persists in the shadow or as the shadow of these beautiful alternates. I feel deep appreciation for revolutionary mothering, which has changed my life and also, in their own words, the lives of several of my students. Lately, I have been wondering, though, if it's important to have a component of our struggles that is trying to go further. And so it seems has Jennifer Nash, the author of Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, also 2018, who has recently applied her critical powers to the subject of Black motherhood specifically. Both in her book, Birthing Black Mothers, and in an essay reviewing revolutionary mothering. As a Black feminist scholar, Nash confesses carefully, I remain both seduced and skeptical of this representation of Black motherhood as radical and revolutionary, as spiritual and transformative. I share Nash's ambivalence. Contemporary visionaries like Alexis Pauline Gumbs are building the knowledge that Black mothering is queer, quote unquote, on strong foundations laid by that earlier giant of queer studies, Cathy Cohen, who proposed to combat the defanging of queerness by tethering it to punks, bull daggers, and welfare queens. But even when welfare, austerity, and prisons are centered in the analytic frame, I don't know if the discourses we tend to assemble under the headers queer, Black, and reproductive justice always help us to name the oppressive structures that queer Black mothering milieus or queer Black mothers themselves might be participating in and upholding. I think revolutionaries must welcome and enable potential challenges from within, challenges from children, for example, who may have their own ideas about how to be in relation, or from women who do not feel that their mothering or their refusal of mothering has yet reached the level of revolutionary. We must hear the grown women, non-binary people, and men who fall within the tent of queer Black mothering by virtue of their class, care responsibilities, gender nonconformity, and or transness, and yet hate the work, desire something else or something more, and simply do not find themselves in the romance. We must stay vigilant in asking, when does the queer pose no challenge to property? To what end are we queering motherhood? To what end, Tiffany Letabo King dares us to ask, are we recuperating and uplifting the queer figure of the Black matriarch? What would happen to our politics were she not redeemed? What kind of destructive collective subject might her redemption qua mother in fact be potentially foreclosing? Are there non-redemptive pathways to a subject position after the family and beyond motherhood yet to be blazed? 10 years after Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, the British feminist critical race theorist Hazel Carby published a very different landmark intervention entitled White Woman Listen. Whereas Spillers had held up the family as potentially beyond redemption, Carby's target was instead the women's movement and its rigid antipathy to the family. Most Black feminists, she said, would not deny that the family can be a source of oppression for us. Yet many still felt frustrated at white feminists' overemphasis on it as a site of oppression. Quote, "The Black family has been a site of political and cultural resistance to racism," Carby stressed. It's true, of course. There can be no family abolitionism without an appreciation for everything the family affords by way of resistant ethnic and communitarian identity, pleasure, and perhaps above all, survival. We must face the question, whose family are we abolishing non-defensively? Still, the answer may not be what we expect. The answer might in fact be, my family first, please. Tiffany Letabo King writes of her commitment to the ongoing life of the Black intramural, which means Black internal or indoor life, as it is lived within her own extended Black diasporic family. While I exist blissfully and sometimes uneasily within a formation that must constantly be reshaped and eventually even abolished, she writes, in order to be capacious and loving enough to address its own violence and continue to invite in all of those that desire its embrace, it may be necessary to go beyond it. While I critique the family and am committed to addressing its limitations, even its elimination, I celebrate the creative ways that Black descendants of captive communities continue to reinvent and conceptualize relationships. To this Black endeavor, I will always be committed. Manifestly then, it is possible to love one's Black family while grasping that the family emerged historically as a category of quote unquote violent forms of humanism. In fact, it is probably because of such a love that one might wish to fight, like King, against the family form, that site of violence and dehumanization that threatens to engulf, she says, Black sociality. So the debate between family reform or expansion and family abolition is not a mere semantic quibble, as Michelle Barrett and Mary McIntosh observed in 1982. I agree with them that while we might not have all the answers right now, ultimately it will be important to determine whether the positive ideals and satisfactions that we hope to strengthen spring from the family or, as they and I argue, survive in spite of it. All of this is maximally difficult political terrain. If the family is a combined and uneven form of thriving, as well as a combined and uneven mechanism of violence denied to some while concentrating power in the hands of others, it is foolish to imagine that there is an interpolative strategy that we could sort of safely choose that would be adequate to the magnitude of the problem that is the family. One option is to specify when we talk about family abolition that we mean the white, cis-heteropatriarchal, nuclear, colonial family. And that might feel safer, but I think it actually poses more dangers in its invitation to excuse or romanticize the political character of all non-white, mixed, gay and or Indigenous homes, while neglecting most people's family abolitionist needs and excluding most people from the affordances and the abundance that family abolitionist politics promises. Another option, therefore, is to cleave to the infinitely harder line, and to say that for historical reasons, there is actually no other family than this family, the family. Obviously, non-white households represent a planetary majority. Many families are not straight, nor even cissexual, nor part of a program of colonizing settlement. But while whiteness, empire, and heterosex have lots to do with the family's most fundamental feature, as Kathy Weeks insists, is that it privatizes care, a process of enclosure in which all kinds of families unintentionally participate. So if we plump for this option, then the family is to be abolished even when it is aspired to, mythologized, valued, and embodied by people who are neither white nor heterosexual, neither bourgeois nor colonizers. And this latter position, as you can see, is the one I think is correct. While there's no equality or justice in the distribution of kinfulness between humans on this earth, and while there is no sense in which white, straight, and or bourgeois people, deserve to reap the rewards of everyone else's courage in abolishing the family, it is yet only in collectively letting go of this technology of privatization, the family, that our species will truly prosper. And at present, it is, of course, standard among practically all communities to celebrate the family as a bastion of relative safety from state persecution and market coercion, and as a space for nurturing subordinated cultural practices, languages, and traditions. But I think this is not enough of a reason to spare the family. Frustratedly, Hazel Carby stressed the fact that, she stressed for the benefit of her white sisters that many racially, economically, and patriarchally oppressed people cleave proudly and fervently to the family. And she was right, nevertheless. As Kathy Weeks puts it, the model of the nuclear family that has served subordinated groups as a fence against the state, society, and capital is the very same white, settler, bourgeois, heterosexual, and patriarchal institution that was imposed by the state, society, and capital on the formerly enslaved Indigenous peoples and waves of immigrants, all of whom continue to be at once in need of its meager protections and marginalized by its legacies and prescriptions. The family is a shield that human beings have taken up, quite rightly, to survive a war. If we cannot countenance ever putting down that shield, perhaps we have forgotten that the war does not have to go on forever. This is why, as Paul Gilroy, author of the legendary There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, remarked in 1993, even the best of the discourse of the familialization of politics is still a problem. In the essay in question, which is entitled "It's a Family Affair," Gilroy is grappling with the reality that in the United Kingdom, as in so-called America, the state's constant disrespect of the Black home and transgression of Black households' boundaries, as well as its disproportionate removal of Black children into the foster care industry, naturally necessitates an urgent anti-racist politics of familialization in defense of Black families. Both the British and American netherworlds of supposedly broken homes that are then seen as efflorescing creatively against all odds have posed an obstinate threat to the legitimacy of the family regime simply by existing, Gilroy suggests. The paradox is that at the same time, the broken, quote unquote, remnant sustains the bourgeois regime insofar as it supplies the culture, inspiration, and oftentimes the surrogate care labor that allows the white household to imagine itself as whole. As a dialectician, I want to have it both ways, writes Gilroy, closing out his essay. Quote, I want to be able to valorize what we can recover, but also to cite the disastrous consequences that follow when the family supplies the only symbols of political agency we can find in the culture, and the only object upon which that agency can be seen to operate. Let us remind ourselves that there are other possibilities. There are other possibilities. Traces of the desire for them can be found in Toni Cade, later Toni Cade Bambara's anthology, The Black Woman, published in America in 1970, not long after the US Labor Secretariat's Moynihan Report. The open season on the Black matriarch was in full swing, and certainly not all of the anthology's feminists in their valiant effort to beat back societal anti-maternal sentiment, matrophobia, and the hatred of Black women specifically, more recently known as misogynoir. Not all of them by any means made the additional step of criticizing feminism within the Black community. But one or two contributors do flatly reject the notion that the family could ever be part of Black and therefore collective human liberation. Kay Lindsay, in her piece, The Black Woman as a Woman, lays out her analysis that, quote, if all white institutions, with the exception of the family, were destroyed, the state could also rise again, but Black rather than white. In other words, the only way to ensure the destruction of the patriarchal state is for the institution of the family to be destroyed. And I mean destroyed, echoes the Feminist Women's Health Center representative Pat Parker in 1980 in a speech she delivered at BASTA, Women's Conference on Imperialism and Third World War in Oakland, California. Parker speaks in the name of the Black Women's Revolutionary Council, amongst other organizations, and her wide-ranging statement, which addresses the Klan, imperialism, and movement building, purposively ends with the family. Quote, as long as women are bound by the nuclear family structure, we cannot effectively move toward revolution. And if women don't move, it will not happen, unquote. The left, along with women, especially of the upper and middle classes, she says, quote, must give up undying loyalty to the nuclear family. It is the basic unit of capitalism, and in order for us to move to revolution, it has to be destroyed. 40 years later, the British writer Lola Olufemi is among those reminding us that there are other possibilities. Abolishing the family, she tweets, that's light work. You're crying over whether or not Engels said it when it's been focal to Black studies and Black feminism for decades. For Olufemi, as for Parker and Lindsay, abolishing marriage, private property, white supremacy, and capitalism are projects that cannot be disentangled from one another. And she is no lone voice either. Annie Olaloku Teriba, a British scholar of Blackness in theory and history, is another contemporary exponent of the rich Black family abolitionist tradition that Olufemi names. In 2021, Olaloku Teriba surprised and unsettled some of her followers by publishing a thread animated by a commitment to the overthrow of familial relations, quote unquote, as a key goal of her anti-patriarchal socialism. These posts point to the striking absence of the child from contemporary theorizations of patriarchal domesticity, and criticize radicals' reluctance to call mothers who violently discipline Black boys into masculinity patriarchal. Quote, the adult-child relation is as central to patriarchy as man/woman, Olaloku Teriba affirms. Quote, the domination of the boy by the woman is a very routine and potent expression of patriarchal power, unquote. These observations reopen horizons. What would it mean for Black caregivers of all genders not to fear the absence of family in the lives of Black children? What would it mean not to need the Black family? Okay, I have promised you a little bit on the question of moving beyond kinship. So I'm going to, skip to that part. Although I realize I've already been talking for 45 minutes. I suppose the main thing to say is that I appreciate that our universal or quasi-universal desire for kinship mediates a desire for care, no more, no less. And it is not our collective desire for care that I am criticizing. It is actually the insufficiency of the vehicle we have at our disposal for that desire's realization. Without wanting to wade too deeply into the weeds of anthropological debates around the definition of kinship, or even, the debates about whether it is important to define kinship or not, I guess I submit that kinship right now is almost always a reference to something immovable, to nature. Perhaps one day it will be fit for purpose again, who knows? Perhaps because the concept of nature has itself been turned inside out. But right now, even when it is conceptualized as practice-based, as it is in many Indigenous cosmologies, kinship functions as a linguistic appeal to something non-contingent that can ground a relation. And I'm asking, can we suspend that fantasy of something non-contingent? Can we let go of it? The kinship value, despite its potentially radical aspiration to encompass the whole world and all the beings in it, is functionally unusable, I think. It is in the current moment a frontispiece for the family. When you drill down into it, blood being thicker than water is always and inevitably kinship talk's central referent and underlying metaphor. Thus, I submit taking family abolitionism seriously requires a serious and concerted effort to loosen, unseat, and unlearn the thought, practice, and language of kinship. It is a simple argument, and one that others before me have expressed more pithily. Quote, it is the belief that kinship, love, and having nice things to eat are naturally and inevitably bound up together that makes it hard to imagine a world in which family plays little part, wrote Michelle Barrett and Mary McIntosh. You may already know their tremendous answer to the question, what would you put in the place of the family? Their answer was simply nothing. If we hold hands, perhaps we can be brave enough to step into the abundance that will be the nothingness that comes after the family. Perhaps your reaction to that proposition is, no thanks, don't we all have enough contingency going on as it is in the maw of the care crisis that is capitalism? Surely the last thing we want to do is ask our loved ones to embrace even more contingency. I have no doubt about it. So acute is our care scarcity. The only way we really know how to offer security to one another is by pretending that our love is non-contingent. You know, when I say to you that you are family, or that I think of you as kin, I'm saying I love you, I care for you, I ensure you, I hold you, I see you. Yes. And, but I am underlining this by using a metaphor that means I have no real choice about the matter. I'm giving you a guarantee. We are kin, tethered to a metaphysical plane. And this feels good, at least it is supposed to feel good. But obviously, an uncomradely hierarchy is baked right into this entire thought structure. Real kin will always be realer. I think we can talk about extending kinship to the whole world all we want, but if kinship were truly something we valued as made rather than given, we would not have to specify the word chosen, as in chosen kinship or chosen family, when we are talking about kinship that isn't imaginable as governmentally ratified through marriage or guardianship, genetic or blood-borne ties. So I think we need concepts with more bite, concepts like comradeliness or accomplice. Or if we want something intermediary, we could also consider resurrecting the defunct first half of the still familiar Old English phrase kith and kin. The concept of kith denotes a form of dynamic relation, a bond similar to kin, but one whose ground is knowledge, practice, and place, rather than race, descent, and identity. What if we reacquainted ourselves with kith and attempted to gently edge out the primacy of kinship, with which kith is obviously massively, you know, connected. The family won't be unmade in language, to be clear, but nor is the semiotic separable from the material. And I'm not prepared to hammer out policy interventions yet. We might be surprised by how much humanity becomes possible when we cease treating each other like family. At the same time, Patricia Hill Collins is right to point out that the language and thought structure of kinship, brother, sister, mother, mama, mommy, father, child, occupies such a prominent place in liberation traditions that rejecting it outright might be counterproductive for groups aiming to challenge hierarchies. However, as Ellen Willis has suggested, to refuse to fight for love that is both free and responsible is, in a sense, to reject the possibility of love itself. We do not have to reject the language of kinship outright. Collectively, rather, we can begin to torque it. It's time to practice being kith, or better, comrades, including towards members of our biofam, our bio family, building up structures of dependency and provision with no kinship dimension. Perhaps we can learn to be strangers again. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for this very enriching talk. I have so many questions, actually, but I would like to ask if there is maybe a question in the audience first before I get into my own questions. And I think Aneta also potentially has some. I think Nina Tafe would like to ask a question. Aneta, could you please unmute?
Hi, thanks. That was a good talk. My question is that elsewhere you described yourself as a social reproduction theorist, and in Full Surrogacy Now, you're focusing a lot on feminized labor. But here you're talking about the family as a mode of governance, as a mechanism of state repression, talking about authority over children in particular. And that all strikes me as kind of removed from the concerns of the SRT. So I wonder if that's still how you would describe your project? And more generally, do you think that social reproduction theory is a sufficient theoretical foundation for family abolitionist politics, or do we have to look elsewhere?
Thank you. Wow, that's a great question. You don't have to answer this, but I'm curious where I said that, because I think it's probably some time since I said that, or at least consciously wrote it down. It's definitely the case that I've learned a lot over the last few years about how that that field actually talks to itself and what it is actually understood to be doing. I think when I still am not entirely sure I understand the parameters and the debates that are, that are seen as falling within SRT and what are not. And so I think it's actually incorrect to think of me as an SRT person. I think that's true. And I've learned as well that I'm not seen that way at all, by the people inside. I suppose what's interesting there is that, I think there are key misunderstandings or divergences in interpretation around, for example, when you look at wages for housework, I see a family abolitionist logic, and others do not. And I think there's something there about the, interpreting things as prescriptive that are meant as descriptive, that form these completely different understandings of what the purview and the project and the horizon might be for this sort of social factory analysis, right? I think it may be, my suspicion is it comes down, as a lot of things come down to your orientation towards work. I've been kind of teaching Kathy Weeks recently, and I think it's really important to revisit and truly try and meditate on her analysis of how deep the moralization of work goes. And, if you think naming something as housework does have somewhat of a moral component, right? As a valorizing strategy, you're going to end up in a non-liberatory place politically, I think. You have to understand that when you're naming something as work, it is not a moral, description for you. It might be for capital, but you have to hold on to the fact that, work is not a liberatory horizon. I suppose if there is one kind of distinguishing feature for me to sort, feminisms, that's kind of currently the one that I keep thinking with, the orientation towards work, right? And so that's why I opened this talk with this suggestion that the family is, the way that, it's the reason we're supposed to want to go to work, and also the reason we can. And I wanted to really think about the family as a technology of work, to make clear that I don't really think of it as a separate out or an outside of capitalism, which I suppose is a bit of a basic point, but I think some social reproduction theory strangely accepts the bifurcation more than I think I expected when I first encountered. Sorry, I'm rambling now, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. I think I read social reproduction like at an angle without realizing I did so.
Thank you, Sophie. In the meanwhile, just an information, we changed the settings. So actually now you can unmute yourselves, but to keep, maybe perhaps if someone else would like to ask a question, please either post it in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourselves. Otherwise, perhaps I can ask a question. I'm so grateful that you brought up towards the end the question of language, which has been something that's bothering me in regards to the notion of kinship or queer kinship, which always when it's spoken of in overly celebratory terms makes me a bit uncomfortable. And I think this discomfort comes from the idea how these terms can become so easily emptied out of their revolutionary meanings, or, you know, they become very tempered. And, you know, a way, like, for instance, the way queerness is mobilized in the name of settler colonialism in certain contexts, and so on. So also, since I operate in the art world tends to be like expert in emptying out the meaning of certain terminology, because there is a lot of make-believe politics, whereas things, you know, don't really change on a structural level, but terms are being like shifted around. And I think I'm still a bit ambivalent about like kinship or not, or other terms, because ultimately, perhaps it's also about what kind of meaning we assign to these words, and how they may change or are being co-opted. And I would like to talk about this idea of terminology again, or language, or how do we need to invent new words or use new words, or rather do we need new fantasies and new forms of desire and meanings? I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this question too, and I think you expressed it very well in your reflection. You know, I probably could have included a bit more on the fact that, you know, there are cultural differentiations around the relation to the stranger, for example. You know, I believe, you know, there are still active sort of norms, for instance, in India, in some parts of India, but these were traditions that also were quite active in Europe and are still talked about in the context of, you know, ancient Greece and Xenia, that have to do with the, you know, the treatment due to a stranger, you know. And I mean, that's, I think I can imagine that there are, you know, vestiges of that in advanced capitalist societies. You know, I mean, it's really a silly thing, but I sort of realized, I was just walking around and I saw the welcome mat in front of someone's house, and I just, you know, it just kind of clashed so much with the what's it called, the Google Ring, is that what it is? You know, the surveillance system that people have on their doors. And I was just thinking about how the word welcome, you know, it comes from a moral commitment on the part of a society and a community as a whole to, you know, feed and shelter the stranger and the visitor. That's, you know, that's where it comes from. The sense that if somebody arrives, you know, in your community, in your home, that you have a set of obligations, you know, immediately. It's so funny to me that we have these ghosts of that idea in the shape of a welcome mat. You know, everyone sort of has one. Do you mean that? I mean, you know, what would it mean to mean that? It says welcome. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I would like to hear from others about ideas for experimental practice, linguistically, to try and unlearn the ways in which commitment is, I mean, I suppose what this really boils down to, and this is an idea that Alexandra Kollontai talked about, is property love, right? We think we only belong to one another when we have one another, and that's, you know, quite a thing for a Bolshevik to sort of theorize, right? It's a little bit sort of, this is about affect, you know, and she's really serious about it. She thinks that our concepts for, you know, psychic security are deeply influenced by property, by capitalist property forms. And so to start unmaking that, I suppose, we'd have to come up with, huge infrastructures and institutions of social provision. For example, a good, like, just off the top of my head, 24/7 free childcare was a very middle of the road feminist demand in the long 60s. You can watch a town hall debate, I think, from maybe 1970, and there's this, like, I might not be able to find it if you ask me for the link right now, but I remember being so startled because they have the sort of wild-eyed revolutionaries on one side of the panel, and then the sort of centrist feminists on the other. But even the most, reasonable feminists in that moment are obviously in favor of, free 24/7 childcare, right? And I just don't really hear this as a feminist demand so much. Of course, there are a lot of things to think about in terms of demands vis-a-vis the state, the risks involved, and what it means exactly to ask for that, and on what terms it could be autonomously, curated and created and merely funded by the state, which is really, by us, right? The state is that's our money. Like, it's another act. But, I wonder if something like free 24/7 childcare would have some kind of role in loosening the deeply privatized nature of relations of belonging. I remember a friend coming back from visiting a commune in Virginia, and simply reflecting on how startling it was to her that everybody just looked after all the kids without really thinking about it, and how she wasn't used to seeing that in a world in which you're not really allowed. For instance, she lives in New York. You're not allowed to look after a child that you meet in the park. I mean, maybe if the child is lost, then as a huge exception, then you have to look after the child as a huge exception. But if a child is just around and putting a rock in her mouth, you're not really, maybe, oh my God, are you allowed to say, don't put the rock in your mouth? Oh, but it's not my child, you don't want to interfere in the ownership structure of the, you can't interpolate a child as a person that you want to hang out with or get to know or care for, because they kind of belong to people, don't they, as property. And I'm interested in experiments in communal childcare for that reason, but I mean, on a big structural level, right? Not on a sort of like private commune level. Oh yeah, Alexandra Kollontai, sorry, I'm just responding to a question in the chat.
Okay, please, I see there are some questions. Emma, would you like to pose your question?
Sure. Sorry, I'm in bed. I just wanted to ask if some of the kind of like a bit trendy at the moment ways of doing relationships, like ethical non-monogamy is the one that's coming to mind right now. Like, if you think that's like a positive thing, or like a step in an interesting direction, or if you have like, yeah, kind of views on that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I think I would maybe summarize my position as being, neither for monogamy nor exactly against it. I'm against property love. Property love, I think, is a good category to think with, because it can happen in any relationship format, right? Like, non-monogamy, monogamy, I guess the crucial question is, I suppose the couple form as a fantasy of that closes down the world, I suppose, you know, as a fantasy that all needs could be met in a kind of private sphere. I think it's right. It's wrong to want your needs to be met in the private sphere exclusively, right? Like, we should not wish to be satisfied by our romantic partners exactly. You know what I mean? Like, that's an antisocial desire. Like, I mean, you know.
10 minutos.
Oh.
Ve a mi cama. Está bien Sudáfrica.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Yeah, so, you know, I mean, cards on the table, I'm, you know, I've always been non-monogamous. I don't really get it. I think there was something missing in my education, like when I was a kid, a very, very sort of horny teenager. I did not understand that, you know, you're not allowed to kiss more than one person or something, like why? I didn't really understand. And I still don't really understand. You know, I think it's important to orient oneself towards, you know, one another's flourishing. You know, if you love someone, you know, you should be pro them kissing people. It hurts, obviously, sometimes. I'm not saying that pain can be, you know, but the problem is, I think different relationship models fantasize that you can remove the pain of contingency from the equation. And I don't think any relationship model can, you know. I just think relationship models can close down possibilities. I mean, that said, you know, there are totally, you know, whatever, ethical ways of doing monogamy. I mean, I'm not sure I'm answering your question very satisfactorily. I guess it depends what angle you're coming from. I feel quite, you know, protective sometimes if people talk about non-monogamy as somehow trendy. I feel a bit like, well, hey, you know, like, so I actually, you know, I need to hear more about where you're coming from.
I'm not really like coming from anywhere in particular. I guess it's like something that to put my cards on the table, also something that I've tried, but I also find difficult in some respects. So I don't know, it's just an agony on question, really, as opposed to like, I'm not coming at it with a theoretical bent in particular. Yeah.
For what it's worth, I read an article recently that annoyed me a lot, trying to make this kind of left case for monogamy because it's somehow supposedly neoliberal to have different relationships to meet different like needs or something. So I just wanted to check, you know, I found that extremely irritating. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yep, I read it also.
There's another question from Katrin Kemp.
Yeah, hi. Hi. I have a question on terminology discussions because I come from old-fashioned queer theory, so I carry a lot of grief in terms of terminology and its uses and abuses and its emptying out. So I was wondering if these terminology discussions aren't a kind of a trap, because we're always opening up models, concepts, and practices to new ways of commodifications, just of systems of relating to each other. So shouldn't we talk more about practice and not so much about terminology? I was wondering.
Yeah, no doubt. But I guess I'm saying that, so I suppose I tried to do a little bit of a disclaimer that I kind of think that, but I also think that the line between semiotic and practical isn't very stable. And I suppose the argument from, you know, Barrett and McIntosh, and I mean, I was rushing at this point because I couldn't believe how long I'd been talking. You know, I thought this would take 25 minutes, but Patricia Hill Collins is, you know, one of the people involved in, you know, considering, and Paul Gilroy, you know, who did think that it was more than just semantic, right? When you look at the ways that language shapes legitimation. And, you know, so for instance, in a Black liberation church, right? Actually, no, I attended a funeral recently. And I was really struck by the constant language of kind of a mother in the movement, you know, referring to different people, honoring them, you know. And I mean, I think this is more than just semantic. It begins to shape, you know, how people are valued. If people's obituaries are always about, you know, them being a mother or, you know, whatever, that you see, I mean, I'm sure you agree, that there are questions there about how to, you know, how to address one another, you know. I think, you know, it's complex for a white person to critique like practices like calling everyone sister, calling everyone brother. I mean, feminism also did it, my sister.
I think I don't mean that so much. I mean, more so the discussion we're having now, because whenever somebody mentions family abolition, you say, oh, what are we going to do instead? Is it going to be kinship?
Okay.
I mean, that part of the discussion. Because
Sure.
I know the academic market and the art market demands that we give our concepts names and they have to be tiny and marketable.
Yeah.
But that's a trap, in my opinion. So.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, I think abolition has a very, you know, massive practical you know, force, and the reason it has become a buzzword is because of the, you know, the millions of feet on the, you know, pounding the tarmac for, you know, over decades. You know, I mean, I think it comes, like most things that, you know, that academia uses, it, you know, it kind of comes from I don't know, places like, you know, Black Twitter or trans Twitter or the streets, you know, and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition being, you know, a presencing and a building, not a some kind of, you know, defunding or divestment or deletion of certain presences in our streets, right? It's not like just take the police precinct and, you know, throw it into outer space, you know, what would that mean? I think the question of abolition, you could also call semantic, right? People want to say, oh, I'm sure you just mean, you know, defund the police. I'm sure you just mean like take that money and put it into all the other functions of the state that could very well, in fact, you know, function as police in a more sort of friendly, liberalized manner. And I think, you know, militants are saying, no, absolutely not, you know. The whole point of taking a particular word is actually to inform, to educate the imagination, and to maybe keep it tangible. That the road is so long, you know, that that the horizon, for example, of family abolition it evokes such an incredibly deep transformation that Kathy Weeks suggests we perhaps aren't even capable yet of, not fully capable yet of desiring it, you know, let alone envisioning it. Yeah.
Thank you. I see there is a question from Aneta.
Yes, yeah, actually you spoke a bit at the end about this, the potential alternatives. And I wanted to ask you, do you talk about alternatives in your book, or you consciously withdraw from that for some reasons that you might have? And then my second question or a comment would be that I have a feeling that there are actually quite many alternatives, and a lot of people practice these alternatives. But when I was looking for some discussions, very, very practical discussions, you know, it's very hard to find anything, especially on the level like something that is more reflected on or theorized. I don't, if you have any interesting sources, text, movies, you can, you know, share, post in the chat. But I have a feeling that the practicalities and also like solutions that could be introduced on the level of state, like you mentioned, this 24-hour childcare, yeah, like I don't I don't see people coming up with this, you know, and I have a feeling maybe maybe this is maybe this practicalities of it, we should kind of deal with that more, you know, and we should experiment more ourselves, because I'm not sure if we, through conceptualizing and theorizing, we will really arrive at some interesting ideas, you know. Maybe we will be bound by our language, and the concepts that we already know are not sufficient. So maybe it has to be kind of actively lived and tried out, and then maybe in some years we will be able to theorize it with some new conceptual structures that we get. So I wanted to ask you about the status of alternatives in your thinking, and and also the others, of course. What do you think? Yes.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear what people's immediate sense of you know, a non-reformist reform, or a transitional demand that in the direction of family abolition would be, you know. I guess off the top of my head, I mean, the thing is, I just want to say, you know, diversity of tactics, I am a very non-strategic person. You know, I do sort of critically utopianist thinking and writing and theorizing, and I think that's okay. I don't want to have to do everything. But off the top of my head, I like the idea of kitchenless cities, right? This was do you know the concept of kitchenless architecture? I mean, I think it also has been sort of neoliberally adopted by somebody in architecture, which is hardly surprising because everything gets, you know, neoliberally recuperated. But I believe utopianist feminist urban planners in the 70s and 80s wanted to kind of build cities that didn't have so many private kitchens, right? And all the kitchens would be common. And I wonder how we could think about this, you know, in terms of free food provision in, you know, in the community, in the city, in the town, you know, so that even if private kitchens exist, it becomes less normal to eat and feed your children always in that way, for example. And I just said the phrase "your children." You know, I do think it is crucial to begin to envision what it would take, what the conditions of possibility would be for you know, children not to be thought of constantly as, you know, belonging simply to two people who authored them, and to, you know, for example, get children you know, into the political space, into the political sphere. But, you know, a totally non-radical columnist, a journalist, recently wrote about how children should be voting. And I don't know why this isn't, you know, a very common discussion, but there's clearly no real reason why children should not be enfranchised, I think, actually. You know, maybe a level, maybe the age of 5 or something, or 6, you know, but maybe it would be useful to be able to speak, I guess. But you know, I think it's important to think about what it would take for children not to be kind of licensed entities who, you know, are registered to particular people without any sort of thought to their I mean, you know, the word for divorcing your parents is emancipation, right? Which I think is an interesting thing to think about, why that's the name for that, the same word that is used for slaves, right? But you know, I'm curious whether things like birth certificates, now that there's a huge biopolitical battle over the bodies of trans children, right? Perhaps there is a possibility here for thinking about going on the offensive in terms of children's bodily autonomy, and also, you know, autonomy more broadly. Like, you know, do children need birth certificates? Like, we're talking about gender markers on ID cards and government, you know, but we could maybe go further and ask whether, you know, what's the point of birth certificates? What do they say? They say what? You know, like they privatize responsibility. You know, what if we had, you know, a bunch of sort of stateless people? I mean, obviously that's not, I'm sorry. This is the problem with utopianism, you know. I'm interested in the really long struggle. And I think when it comes to the as I called them, non-reformist reforms, you know, we're talking about stuff that every, you know, socialist or communist wants, you know, free universal healthcare, you know, free transport, free non-commodified housing, you know, no borders.
I actually encountered these kitchenless apartments in Krakow. They were built in communist times. And I'm recently fantasizing, you know, thinking a lot about the canteens, you know, in communist times that I used to visit with my mother every day, you know, going to canteen. Yeah. So these ideas, some things were already tried out.
Yes, there's a wonderful essay. I think she's called Rebecca Johnson, a writer about the beauty of the canteen form, really recently. Yeah, thank you for raising that. I know we've kind of gone over time, haven't we? But I think there's another question I'd love to hear.
If we can still have one more question, then Jean Hughes, if you could pose your question.
Oh, we don't hear you. Something is with the micro. We just heard something.
We can't hear you,
maybe
unfortunately.
at some point you could hear something.
Perhaps if you could write your question quickly.
No, we really want to have your question, so you have to write in the chat.
It's more a remark about building in Scandinavian countries having no private shower, like in Copenhagen, and common area to eat.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, that really struck me. I mean, Scandinavia fantasies in America are super annoying. Yeah. Because I mean, and I'm sure you're not, but where I'm situated, it's really like, you know, it seems to be the horizon of possibility. That said, as someone, you know, who grew up in France and to some extent the UK, where I sound like I'm from, and who currently lives in the US, you know, I did go to where was it? Copenhagen, I think, and stayed in a, you know, backpackers hostel. And I was like, this is the most luxurious place. Look at this kind of communal, you know, communal bathrooms, communal kitchens. Oh my goodness. So I got quite excited. I think it's important to really amplify the conversations that are happening to some extent in you know, ecological and climate justice kinds of conversations about the you know, the complete lunacy of the private nuclear household with lawns, you know, the ecocidal, you know, logic of the private nuclear home should be connected to the you know, anti-child, anti-woman, pro-work, pro-capitalism sorts of functions of it as a technology. And I think you know, thinking about why everything needs to be replicated over and over. I mean, this could degenerate into simply an anti-consumerist politics, you know, but I think it's a necessary component. Like, why does every single house on the street have to have you know, a lawnmower? What, you know, why does everyone have to have a washing machine? Why does everybody, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And I was listening to Dean Spade talking recently about mutual aid, and I mean, it made me a little sad to think about how right he is and how much it includes my own life. But, you know, the de-skilling, he talks about de-skilling, you know, involved in contemporary sociality, how, you know, the forms of entertainment and leisure that have become even more entrenched during the pandemic are such that people don't really, in some parts of society increasingly, don't know how to be together, don't know how to look after one another, don't know how to build the worlds that they need in order to be together. And it's an Ouroboros. But we have to start somewhere. I was, you know, quite inspired by an article in Pinko magazine by Lou Cornham, who's a militant and Indigenous communist, and it's called Desiring the Tribe. And perhaps surprisingly, given that some, you know, so for example, Alexis Shotwell, the feminist philosopher, is talking about how white people cannot, you know, borrow Indigenous kinship modalities, right? She's very sort of clear about that. But I was actually reading Lou Cornham and getting a completely different message, you know. They were saying, you know, yeah, there's a whole history of like you were saying, Chris, or referring to, you know, queer settler colonialism, you know. And at the same time, you know, having said that, I think, you know, there still needs to be a and now what, right? And like I was saying, or trying to say in my talk, it's sort of true, like Alexis Shotwell is very good at reflecting on that there's no sense in which white people deserve, you know, to have the family abolished, you know, in a sense. But it's this incredibly kind of fucked historical conjuncture where there's this technology that has kind of like been sapping all of the reproductive labor from, you know, all the other sort of quarters of society and you know, sort of sucking it into the care and nourishment and replenishment of the few. And yet what, right? And I think Lou Cornham is saying, hell yeah, fuck it, whatever, let's everyone join the tribe, you know, desiring the tribe. And there was this other kind of category, I guess, that we haven't mentioned yet in terms of, you know, kinship, kith, whatever. You know, I suppose tribe is something that could be thrown into the mix here. Because I think Lou Cornham is saying, you know, this is a matter of survival. Well, I don't want to paraphrase too much. Maybe I'm extrapolating too far, but there was certainly no condemnation of, you know, settler, you know, attraction, you know, to the affordances of Indigenous sociality.
There's a very brief comment question in the chat. I will just read it out, and I think it perhaps just relates to what you told earlier. How would you contrast what you say against traditional joint family when a household of 10-20 people share a kitchen, common space, bathrooms, and have a level of integration far stronger than society? Would it be going back to the past, or are you suggesting creating new versions of joint families? Because the idea of unlimited kitchen or any resource, common space does not exist. There is always a limit.
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't know how I've come across, but I'm certainly not saying that somehow like people shouldn't live anywhere or with anyone. I mean, of course, like, you know, this is maybe a risk when I don't like say what I want. The problem is I don't really want to be an urban planner or to produce these solutions. You know, it's true when Michelle Barrett and Mary McIntosh say, you know, people are always asking, what would we put in the place? And they say, we would put nothing in place of the family. There's a provocation there that I do want to take seriously, but it is also a provocation. I do want to take the provocation seriously, because if we're thinking about the family as a technology of austerity and the private nuclear household as a technology of austerity, then it becomes a bit silly to ask this question, what would you replace it with, right? Oh, what would you replace, you know, capitalism with? Well, you know, let's get rid of it first, you know, like, but I mean, you know, of course people will live in places and homes, I guess. I don't know. That's an imaginative question that I certainly have no, I'm not imagining that there's some kind of, you know, set limit on how many people can live in a home, right? Like, I mean, that's not where my imagination is engaged in. But people that are my comrades, like Michelle O'Brien, are really, you know, are thinking a little bit about how we might build infrastructures that include spaces for, you know, intimate and small numbers of people to engage in some aspects of life, and then have the sort of infrastructures of, you know, washing and cleaning and entertainment sort of integrated. I guess this maybe starts sounding a bit like Charles Fourier's phalanstery, you know, the 19th century utopian socialist who believed that there should be 1,200 people, I think, specifically and precisely in a vast kind of living complex that would have abolished work and abolished sexual and bourgeois morality and all kinds of other things. Shulamith Firestone talks about 200 people. I've forgotten how many people in her version, but you know, people have these different blueprints and proposals. There's an anti-authoritarian communist group in London called the Angry Workers of the World, who have a template for living together. I believe they think 200 people as well, maybe 100. Any case, yes, I can see, Monica, you've got some ideas. Roxanne Dunbar, yeah. So, you know, I certainly think living in a house with 10 or 20 people is greatly preferable to the isolation of you know, in fact, I think if I'm interpreting the statistics correctly, a majority of people live alone in some cities. It's horrifying.
I think in Sweden, actually, there's a large part of the population, almost 60%.
In Germany as well. In Germany as well.
Because we resisted the communal kitchen and the communal washing rooms that we had in the 50s and the 60s, and zero privacy. So
yeah, I mean, this is the thing, we need to be wary of the romance of community as well, right? Communitarianism is not the same as communism, and that's a whole other discussion that I'm very sorry. I think I'm going to have to go in a minute.
Yes, thank you so much, Sophie. We already went over time. It was a pleasure to have you, and thank you for sharing the complexities, the visions, your ideas, the critique of the family. It's been truly a pleasure. And thank you for your generosity, for sharing excerpts from your book. Hope you won't get in trouble for doing that. And it was amazing talking to you also in person, and not only reading your brilliant thoughts.
I'm glad it was generative. I've had a wonderful time. Thank you for your attention and the honor of inviting me. I hope your group, which seems totally amazing, continues to I'd love to be kind of updated on where it all goes. It seems like a really great initiative. So
we will keep you posted.
Yeah.
I also want to thank all the participants. I want to say that if there are some specific issues here that are interesting for you and would like to discuss them, I paste here my email address. And if you would like to stay in touch with us in future and propose some topics or people to this project, just write us, and because it's still quite open, so the trajectories are also defined by you. So don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.